back to another exciting episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Wes Bryant, and in today's episode, we're coming back with more VMware. That's right, VMware Certified Professional version 6. We're back at a part 2 with Virtual SANs, and joining me back in the studios is none other than Mr. Don Pezet. Don, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing swell, Wes, ready to jump in and actually get our Virtual SANs configured. In our last episode, I went on for effectively half an hour talking about what we need to do to get ready to deploy a vSAN, which mostly centered around setting up the distributed virtual switch. And so once we have that network infrastructure in place, now it's time to actually go and get the Virtual SAN turned on. And it's somewhat anticlimactic because getting it turned on is super easy, but there's a lot of configuration options afterwards that we can go in and tweak the way that it behaves and have some fun with it, right? So let's not dilly-dally. We're going to jump right in and get that vSAN configured. So I'm going to jump right back into my environment, and what we've got is, according to VMware recommendations, I now have 3 hosts that I'm going to be deploying a vSAN on, 2 of which have storage available, 1 of which does not, right? So let's just take a look at that storage before I actually get things set up. So I'm going to go into the host. I'll take host 1, and I'm going to go to Manage and Storage, and I'm going to look at the storage devices. Now, before you turn on the vSAN, it's probably a good idea to double check this anyway, especially if you're doing a hybrid deployment, because some disks are going to be SSD and some are going to be magnetic, and we need to make sure they were identified correctly. Usually they are, but sometimes it gets it wrong, so here's a chance for us to fix it. So when I go under my storage devices, I've got a 128 gig disk and a 500 gig disk. The 500 gig one is magnetic. The 128 gig is SSD. And so I need to make sure they're identified correctly. And as I look, I can see the 128 gig is flash and the 512 gig is an HDD or magnetic. If they were wrong, you can click on them and just hit the little button here to change them from one to the other, right? We can actually change it during the wizard for setting up the vSAN also, so there's more than one opportunity for us to fix this. I just like to have it set right from the beginning. And if I take a look at host 02, I'm just going to double check that same thing and make sure that it's set for flash and magnetic. Now, my drives are identical. I've got a 128 gig SSD and a 512 gig HD in both systems, right? They don't have to be identical. VMware recommends it. They recommend that they be configured the same because it makes managing this a lot simpler, but you can have different sizes and so on. It is possible. All right, but I've got my storage. I know I've got my distributed virtual switch set up and that we've got that dedicated for our vSAN. If we didn't, it'll warn us during the wizard. At this point, we're ready to turn it on. Now the vSAN is configured at the cluster level. So if I'm going to set up a vSAN, I need my nodes to be in the cluster, and we did that in the last episode. All 3 of my hosts are right here in the same cluster. And then we're just going to jump over here to Manage, and under Manage, you'll have a section here for the Virtual SAN. Okay. Now the Virtual SAN does require a license to be installed to support it, but it won't let you install the license ahead of time. If you go to install the license, it'll actually let you add the license, but if you try and attach it to the cluster, it won't let you attach it to the cluster until the vSAN is turned on, right? Because it's going to do some checks to make sure our hardware is compatible. And VMware doesn't want you assigning a license to a host that's not compatible, right? So that's why they stop you from doing it. So when I come in here, I'm not going to worry about the license just yet, but later I'll need to come back in and attach the license to the system so that it'll be able to work. It'll just run in an eval mode in the beginning. So I'm going to go under Virtual SAN and General, and you'll see Virtual SAN is turned off with a big warning that the Virtual SAN is not enabled. So not too much to see here except for the big fat configure button up top, which is exactly what I want. When you choose that, it's going to launch you into the vSAN wizard, and the vSAN wizard is pretty straightforward. It's going to check all that stuff that we set up in the last episode to make sure it was done. And if something wasn't done, it'll stop us, right? So hopefully we've dotted our I's and crossed our T's and everything's the way that we need. So it's going to ask me to make a few choices here. The first one, how do we want to add disks to the storage? There's 2 modes. You can go manual or automatic. If I choose automatic, anytime I add a host to the vSAN, if they have unclaimed disks, it'll claim the disks and throw it into the vSAN, right? I may want that. I may want it to be automatic. I may not, though. Maybe I've got some flash sitting there that I'm going to turn on for vFlash later. I don't want that to be a part of the vSAN. I'm going to be using it for vFlash. Or maybe I'm bringing in a witness host. I just need it to be a witness. I don't want it to actually host storage, so I don't want it to claim those disks. So I prefer to go manual on this one, but you can go automatic, and that makes it really easy to throw new hosts into the vSAN, and their storage just automatically gets set up. Some people like that. I'm not a big fan of automatic. Then we've got deduplication and compression. This is kind of a neat one too. Traditionally, when you store data on a SAN, the data is just written. And if I have 100 copies of the same file, it stores it 100 times and that's that. But with a vSAN, it's looking at the data because it's synchronizing it between hosts. And when it does that, if it sees identical data, it can store one copy of it with pointers that say, here's links back to the same data. To your operating systems, to your guests, they don't know it. It just all looks the same to them. But on the storage side, we can really get some extra storage out of the system and it can improve things. That's an optional feature you can turn on. Compression, same thing. We can compress the data so it takes less space. That does cause a bit of a performance hit, so a lot of people don't like that one. But you can turn it on. If you turn it on, it's both. You turn on deduplication and compression, not one or the other. It's going to be both. All right. You've also got this option here called Allow Reduced Redundancy. When I said duplicate files, I made the mistake I hate making, which is I said it's going to store one copy of that file. It actually doesn't. It stores 2 copies of the files. So if I have 100 instances of that file, it's going to store 2 copies because if one copy fails, we need a backup, right? But if I allow reduced redundancy, now it will store one copy of that file. And if I lose that one copy, it's like losing the 100 copies, right? That would be really bad. So we don't normally want that, but you can turn it on and you'll save a ton of space, but there's that big trade-off. Then fault domains. All right, under fault domains, here's where I can tell it how I want to set things up. And notice the very first option here, configure, well, the first option is to not configure it. I guess I should include that. But the second option is configure 2-host virtual SAN cluster. And I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute, Don, you said the minimum requirement is 3. What's this 2-host stuff? Well, 2 hosts are in the vSAN, and 1 host is a witness. This is actually 3 hosts, not 2. And if you kind of click on the little eye here, it'll pop up and tell you 2 hosts at one site and a witness host at another site. So 3 hosts, 2 sites, right? That's what it's talking about there with that option. So if I'm going to have a witness, I can choose that one. If I choose do not configure, I can actually set up a 2-node system. It's just, it might make bad choices. That happens. I want to do a 3 system, right? 2 hosts in the vSAN, 1 as a witness. You can also do a stretched cluster. This is where my cluster is not just in one building, that I have it in 2 separate facilities. I have production and disaster recovery, so I can spread that out. And I can configure those fault domains. With fault domains, the servers might all be in the same building, just in different racks. And so I want to isolate the systems based on what racks they're in so they can recognize when they have those failures. So I can configure that too. It's up to me how I want to go about this. I certainly don't have to configure any of that right now. I can just set up the straight up vSAN and be done with it, or I can configure the advanced options. And what you'll notice is that over here, see these little menu items over here? As I choose different options, see how it changes? So depending on what I pick, there's more or less that I might have to do. If I do a stretched cluster, that's the hardest one. That's where we have to do fault domains, we have to do witness hosts, right? So we have to do multiple things. But if I just choose to configure a vSAN cluster, I just have to pick a witness host. I don't have to set up fault domains. And if I choose fault domains, I do the fault domains, but I don't have to pick a witness, right? So these are really 3 variations of the same thing, just picking which components we have. And if you choose do not configure, you can always come and add this stuff later on. It's all easy to change after the fact, all right? But I'm going to do a 2-host virtual SAN cluster for right now is what I'm going to do. All right. Now, when I do that, it's warning me here. It says you must have exactly 2 hosts in the cluster in order to configure a 2-host virtual SAN cluster. My problem is I brought my witness host into the cluster, right? So I don't have exactly 2, I have 3, and so it's complaining about that. I forgot about that requirement. So maybe I'll do not configure instead, and we'll add that in after the fact. Or I could do fault domains. I'll leave it this way. I'll do not configure. All right. Now it's double checking my network, and hopefully you don't have anything to do on this screen. It's checking because, remember, every host has to have a VM kernel adapter that's set to carry vSAN traffic. They've got to be plugged in with an IP address so they can see each other, and vSAN has to be enabled. And so looking at my 3 systems, they're all plugged into that same port group. They've all got IP addresses in the same subnet, and vSAN is enabled for all of them. My networking is already taken care of. All right, one thing it doesn't do here, it doesn't check to see if it's a 10 gig network or a 1 gig network. That's up to you. If you choose a 1 gig network and you're doing all flash, your performance is just going to be terrible, right? But it'll work, and that's basically what they're confirming right here. All right, then we can claim disks. Now, it's up to me how I want to go about this. I can claim the disks now, or I can claim them later. And what it's going to do is it's going to set up 2 tiers of data. So you've got your capacity tier and your cache tier. And if you look at my buttons up here, which are mostly grayed out, you'll see this one, claim for capacity tier, and then this other one, claim for the cache tier. All right, so cache, that's that read cache where it speeds up read activity on the disk. That's going to be my flash. And then this other one is claim for capacity tier. That's where my actual data is going to be. In an all flash environment, we don't really worry about this, right? It's just all capacity tier, who cares? But in a hybrid environment, I want my flash disks to be flagged for cache, and I want my magnetic disks to be flagged for capacity. And so I can come through and I can pick that. So as I look at it, I'm seeing some of the different disks that are available. And if I expand them out, I can see where they exist, right? So here's the 512 gig disks, and then I've got some 128 gigs, and I just need to make sure they get claimed correctly. And you can go through and do it one by one, or you can highlight more than one at the same time and claim them. So I'm going to take these 128 gig disks and claim them for the cache tier. And then I'm going to take these 512 gig disks down here and claim them for the capacity tier. I've got one extra disk in here, a 512 gig disk. I guess that's in host 03. I must have left a larger flash in there. So I'm just going to ignore it. I'm not going to claim it at all. But otherwise, I've got my capacity disks and my cache disks. And I don't have to claim the disks now. I could actually set this up with no disks and claim them after the fact and go from there. All right. Now I do get a warning down here. It says configuration not recommended. Some hosts are claiming less disks than others. That's going to be host 3, right? Host 3, I didn't set to claim any disks, and I'm okay with that. It's not going to be in the vSAN. In fact, I ought to just pull it out of the cluster. Now, if I yank host 3 out of the cluster, it can stay as a part of that switch, which means it'll have communications, and then we can just use it as the witness. I've got it in the cluster right now, so whatever. All right. Notice my total vSAN data store capacity is 1 terabyte, right? So I had 2 500 gig disks that are going to combine to 1 terabyte, and I had 228 gig SSDs that are going to combine to 256 gigs of cache. We go ahead and finish that up, and now it's going to create that vSAN. Now, hopefully in your environment this goes very smoothly. In my environment, I'm going to get some warnings, right? My primary warning is going to be that I have hardware that's not on the HCL, right? In my lab environment, I'm kind of cheating the rules a little bit on a few things, so I'm going to get some warnings about that. By and large, you can ignore the warning right up until the point that you need to call VMware for help. And then you can't ignore that warning anymore because they're not going to be able to help you. So you certainly want to resolve any warnings that you get. One piece of advice, don't act on the warnings right away. Some warnings are going to pop up here that just take a little time to resolve, all right? Especially when it comes to claiming those disks, because it has to grab the disk, has to format it, creates a data store, brings it up. That takes some time. So for the first 5 or 10 minutes, you probably don't want to act on your warnings right away, okay? Just wait 10 minutes. Let the cluster kind of settle itself down and resolve its issues, and then anything that's still standing, any warnings that are still standing, then you act on those, okay? But they do need a little bit of time. So I'm getting some warnings that are popping up here as this one's jumping up, and so as I look at my lab cluster, I can go to my summary screen and see what those warnings are, and they'll probably be HCL warnings. I might have a few others, and oh, actually the warnings on my cluster have already disappeared. Let's look at my individual host and see what warnings are popping up there. All right, so this one says, host cannot communicate with all other nodes in the virtual SAN enabled cluster. All right, I got a network problem. Now, I've made the mistake of acting on this one right away before, and I'll tell you, it's still activating those adapters for vSAN traffic, and they're going to start communicating, and we just need to wait and let it resolve that. If that's still up a few minutes from now, then I'll get worried about it, all right? But for right now, we're going to let it sit tight and see where that goes, okay? Now, while I'm waiting on it, I do have host 03 where I need to make a choice. If I want to make it as a witness, I need to get it out of the cluster. I could put it into another cluster, or I could leave it in this one. I could take it out, I suppose. It's not actually, I didn't claim any storage for it. It's just kind of sitting there, so I can take it out of the cluster and just throw it back into the data center and move it along. Oh, shoot, got to move it into maintenance mode first. So this will give me a good stalling point here to wait on those other errors to kind of shift along. Now, if I had virtual machines that were active, I'd be worried about that. In this case, I don't. So we can just take that and shift it along and get that one out of there. That'll also resolve the error about having different hosts claiming different storage and kind of resolve a few different things at once. I'll just take that one right back out of maintenance mode and get that one back online. Okay. I'm going to watch my recent tasks. Looks like everything is showing as completed. So now I'm going to do exactly what I said not to do and just come in here and double check my alarms. Now when I look at my alarms, I can see Virtual SAN Health Alarm, ESX Virtual SAN Health Service Installation. What kind of alarm is that, right? It's telling me that it's installing the health service, and that's really it. It's not so much something I need to act on, right? And then I've got health service alarm for overall health summary. All right, now I've got some health problems, right? And then my actual alarm, which is the cluster health. So this is the real alarm. Well, I expect the cluster to have problems right now, so I'm going to reset these to green because more than likely they've already resolved their problem. And then what we can do is we can refresh our view and see whether or not these pop back up or not. Okay, and that's important in the early stages because a lot of it does get activated. You've got multiple hosts that are talking together. If you have fully HCL listed hardware with plenty of RAM, you'll find a lot of this stuff moves through very fast. In a lab environment like mine where I'm kind of constrained on resources, things run a little bit slower, and that makes these errors pop up a little more frequently. All right, looking at this next one, I've got host cannot communicate with all of the nodes in the virtual SAN cluster, which that'll probably be resolved here shortly too, and probably the same error on host 02. Yeah, so we just need to let those kind of cruise along and they'll get happy again. All right, so how do I know when everything's running nice and happy? Well, technically my vSAN is on. I've got it configured. I haven't configured a witness host. I haven't configured fault domains or anything like that. I've really just turned on the vSAN. How do I know it's working? Well, two ways, right? First off, I can go to the cluster, and if you go to Manage, Settings, and Virtual SAN, we can see here whether or not we're enabled and whether we've got the system turned on. And you can go to disk management and you should be able to see your disks in here, right? So if I'm not seeing disks, then I've got a problem, but if I am seeing the disks and they're showing as mounted and connected, that's a good sign. See how all of mine are showing healthy and that they're a hybrid configuration. So that's one quick way that we can look and verify that things are set the way that we want. Now I do still have my warnings floating on the server, but again, those are network issues that should work themselves out as soon as they start talking on the network. Now, I could have a legitimate network problem, right? I did pick VM kernel 1 on both servers and connected them. I gave them IPs. They should be able to see each other, but it is possible that I've screwed up that network or not plugged in those adapters, so I may have to go and check my physical cabling, but I'm pretty used to seeing this error, so it'll usually go away. All right, the other thing that I can do is we can take a look at monitoring. So if I go to my cluster and I go to the Monitor tab, inside of the Monitor tab, you actually have a button up here for Virtual SAN. And so you can choose that, and it's going to bring up that same disk stream where we can verify that disk health, but you can also look at the virtual disks that have been created. I haven't made any yet. Our resyncing components and see what their health is at, and then your general health. Remember all the health warnings I had a few moments ago? When I come in here to health, if any of those warnings are still there, I'll see them. And sure enough, I've got some. My main warning is hardware compatibility, and I knew I was going to get that, right? I knew I was going to have some that weren't on the HCL, and so I've got a couple of warnings there for that. And then I've got a performance service warning, which is telling me my StatsDB object is having an issue. Now that's another error that you can expect to see because what's going to be in your statistics database in the beginning? Nothing, right? It's empty, it can't get data. It's got to harvest some information first before it can get data. So that's another warning that'll resolve itself over time. And so you can just wait and be patient, or you can sit here and re-click retest over and over and over again, and eventually they'll go away. But for right now, we can kind of ignore them. All right. So everything's looking pretty decent. I do have my StatsDB object down here. Object exists warning. You know, there's no data. It just has to build that up. All right. But at this stage, I've got my vSAN. My vSAN's up, and I'm pretty much ready to use it. Right. Now, how do I use it? Well, when we created the vSAN, it should have created a data store to put in as a part of it. We just use it like any other data store that's out there. If I come into my system again, I'm going to jump over to my storage screen. And on my storage screen, I've got a new data store. I didn't make that. It just magically appeared, right? And so I've got vSAN data store right here. And that's my vSAN, right? It's just a data store like anything else. If you look at the URL for it, see how it's datastore://vmfs/volumes. It's just registered in here, but it is registered as a vSAN. And on the back end, it's spreading that across the different environments. And you can see my vSAN capacity screen right here, where it is aware that it's a vSAN, and I've got 1 terabyte of space in it because I bonded those 2 500 gig drives. The 256 gigs of cache doesn't show up here because it's cache. I can't store data there. It stores it for me. I just see the 1 terabyte of basic storage. Now, whenever I create a virtual machine, so if I go into my cluster and I go to create a new virtual machine, when we create a virtual machine and we pick the storage for it, so maybe I'm going to make a database server, right? So DB01, I'll put it in my data center. I'll put it in the lab cluster. I'll stick it on host 01. When we go to pick our storage, we'll see our data stores appear. And as soon as it refreshes, there we go. Here's my vSAN data store. And I can just choose that data store. I can provision my disk and pop it right in there, and then we'll be in business.
And Don, with these data stores, I know that they can be virtual volumes. Are these going to be virtual volumes here in the SAN?
You know, I'm glad you asked that, Wes. So yeah, virtual volumes. Virtual volumes are a technology that doesn't get used a whole heck of a lot. And you guys might have noticed it in the storage episodes, right? If I go to create like a new data store, right? So if I go into host 01 or one of these guys, and I go to create a new data store in here, when you create a data store, you get 3 choices. VMFS is what we normally do. And then you've got NFS, and then you've got vVol, virtual volumes, right? Well, we're working with virtual SANs, so it makes sense you'd have virtual volumes on a virtual SAN, right? Well, the two are actually unrelated. They're 2 different technologies. So let's talk about virtual volumes real quick, just to make sure we avoid confusion on this one. Now, virtual volumes do show up on the exam as one of the things they want you to be aware of, but there's not a whole heck of a lot to configure with virtual volumes, so it doesn't show up that prominently. VMware. The guys at VMware created an API, an application programming interface. There we go. So that vSphere can talk to SANs, can talk to physical storage area networks. And that means that vSphere can actually configure your SAN for you. It can reach out and configure the SAN. It can slice disks. It can make volumes. It can do all sorts of stuff and create those without you ever having to go to your SAN management utility, right? So if you have a EMC SAN or an HP SAN, you have your management utilities that you use. And you go in there and you slice off volumes, you create a LUN, you set up your LUN masking, you attach it, and so on. All that stuff you do in this third-party software. Well, with the VMware APIs, vSphere can do that for you. You create a virtual machine and you say, give it a virtual volume, and it'll reach out to the SAN, it'll make that volume, it'll make a LUN, and it'll attach it to this host, and it'll get it assigned so you can start to put your disks into it. Right? That's what a vVol is, a virtual volume. And it works on a SAN. It's not a part of vSANs, though. You can use vVols without vSANs, and you can use vSANs without vVols. The two are not dependent. They're really 2 separate things, and if you choose to deploy it, you can. You do have to make sure your hardware is supported. vVols only work on SANs that are part of the hardware compatibility list. So it's got to be a SAN officially supported by VMware. If it's not, then vVols don't work, and you just ignore that option on the screen like most of us do. But, but if you have a SAN that's supported, boy, is it convenient. Because now I don't have to go to some third-party SAN management software. I just do it right here from the vSphere web client. I tell it to create a vVol, and it talks to the SAN, and it makes it for me. Right? In fact, the only thing you really have to do to get this set up is to make sure that that your storage controller is working. Because your storage controller is how you see the SAN, and then that's how you detect whether or not it supports the VMware API. The VMware API, I always forget its name, so I wrote this down because the name can turn up on the exam. It's the VASA API, V-A-S-A, and that stands for VMware vSphere API for Storage Awareness. Rolls right off the tongue. So the vSphere API for Storage Awareness API. I guess we'll double up on that one. That's what that is, and it's just a part of vSphere. It's on automatically. We just manage our storage providers, right? Your storage providers are how you connect. You have storage endpoints. That's the SAN that you talk to. You can see those if we go. Let me cancel out of this. Let me go back to like my host here. Or actually, I need to do it from the vCenter server. So I'm going to go up here to the vCenter server, and if we just go to Manage, and you've got the Storage Providers tab. And under Storage Providers, here's where you can attach your storage providers. And see my vSAN is showing up, right? These are endpoints that point to the vSAN, and each one has a URL, and it's showing all the different hosts that are a part of that vSAN. And see how it's using the VASA API? VASA API 1.5 to talk to that vSAN, okay? So there's VMware's own vSAN that we just set up, which means technically I could create a vVol on the vSAN if I wanted, right? But we traditionally use it with physical SANs. And so you'd come in here and you'd hit your little plus sign, and you'd add in the management information for communicating with that physical SAN. And if you've got an EMC or an HPE or whatever, then their documentation will tell you exactly what to put in here. and you can connect up, and now you can create vVols on that system. So the two technologies are separate, but they can be used together, and it does create a little confusion because it's vSAN and vVolume. It basically sounds the same.
Don, you mentioned a little bit about monitoring. Can you tell us a little bit about the vSAN Observer?
Yeah, so actually there's a few advanced features that I haven't really dinked with yet, right? We turned the SAN on, and then we saw how we could use it, but we haven't actually kind of messed with the cool stuff. So fault domains, I know we talked about, but didn't see storage policies we haven't even talked about yet. And then we've got the vSAN Observer. These are three things that aren't required. We don't have to use them, right? But if you want to, they extend the functionality of the virtual SAN. So let's run through all three. You mentioned the vSAN Observer, right? The vSAN Observer is a cool feature of vCenter that is, not only is it not turned on by default, it is like super hidden away in the back end of vCenter that unless you know it's there, you'll never see it, and it's kind of unfortunate. When it comes to monitoring performance of the vSAN, it's really important because your vSAN, it might be slow for reasons that could be avoided. If you just added some more disks, if you upgraded your network adapters, how do you know how the vSAN is really doing? Well, the vSAN Observer can show us that, right? So what we do is we jump over to our vCenter server. So I'm going to get on my vCenter server here. This is my Windows Server 2012 machine that's running vCenter 6. And I'm going to drop to a command prompt, okay? And in the command prompt, I am going to start up the vSAN Observer. The vSAN Observer actually runs a little web server, and the web server is tied to the performance database on the back end so that it can show us some information. To get that launched, it's actually written in Ruby, and most of us don't have like a Ruby on Rails system set up on our server to run, and on Windows we definitely don't. So they actually have this packaged in with a little batch file that I'm going to run. So we need to get into the vCenter folder. So I'm going to change directories into program files /VMware /vCenter server /RVC. All right, that's where I want to get to. And this is where my vCenter Observer, my vSAN Observer is tucked away. And in here, you got a couple little batch files, and this is the batch file I want, this rvc.bat. So I'm going to run rvc.bat, just like that, to launch the batch file. And it's going to come up, and you'll see where it's trying to log me in as administrator at vsphere.local. Okay, if you've logged in with the account before, then it'll automatically log you in. If you haven't, it'll prompt you for the password. So I got to punch in my password. And this is it connecting into the vCenter database on the back end. All right, so I'm creating a web server and attaching to that database to launch it. Now, I do have to tell it a little bit more information. I'm seeing a file system here, kind of like when you browse your hard drive, C:/program files. Here I've got localhost for managing the host that I'm on. So I'm going to change into that directory. It's not really a directory. This is like a logical hierarchy. It's kind of like navigating the Active Directory in Windows or something like that. And I need to get into, let's see, my data center. My data center is called Data Center. If you don't remember, you just go back to your web client and look at it. So I'm going to browse into my data center. And this is just my data center name from right here. So if I had named it Bob, I would be changing into the Bob folder. And then once I'm in there, now I can fire up my vSAN Observer. So I'm going to say vSAN.observer, and then I need to point it at some servers. And I'm just going to point it at /computers/ and now the cluster name. And my cluster name I actually have forgotten is lab cluster. So I need to tell it that name so that it'll attach to the lab cluster, right? Then I need to tell it to run the web server. And I'm going to tell it to force it to run. You don't always need that option. What I'm telling it is basically if it detects another web server, don't stop, just run anyway. A lot of times you're running IIS, and so we get a conflict, right? Because both of them want port 80 or whatever. But the vSAN Observer runs on its own little port, so it's not normally an issue. So I'm going to tell it to force to run, okay? And it's going to fire up, and looks like I've launched this one before. If you've never launched it before, it'll show you a certificate fingerprint and ask you to accept it. In my case, I've launched it before, so it's already got the fingerprint. So that's the certificate, the SSL certificate. So it's not asking me to accept it. If you get prompted, you just say yes, and then it launches. And so now I'm running a web server. It's running the vSAN Observer in the background, and it's ready for me to go and harvest some data out of it. And I can fire up a web browser on this machine or on another machine. I'll just use this machine. and we can browse to it and see. So it's just going to be browsing to https:// and whatever your server name is. I'll just use localhost :8010, right? 8010 is the port number, and it's a self-signed certificate, so I've got to just continue in. And now I'm going to be accessing the vCenter Observer web interface. And so I can get logged in, and now I start to see performance of the vSAN. And mine is going to be super boring because I don't even have a single VM running inside of it yet. But you get this nice layout, and the best part about this is I'm seeing the vSAN for both of the hosts that are in the vSAN. If I had 64 hosts, I'd see 64 entries here with the performance on every one of them. So if there's a bottleneck, it could be tied to one particular host having a problem, I could spot it here. You see the latency, the IOPS, the bandwidth, if there's any congestion, the outstanding I/O, how far behind is this host to applying input and output on it? And so you can start to see that and get an idea of how things are functioning. You can do vSAN disk deep dive, and you can break down into the individual disks and start to look at the performance on the hardware. So here's the SSDs versus the hard drives, right? The magnetic disks, and you can start to monitor that performance. You can look at all sorts of information about the vSAN. It's super, super useful to be able to pull this information and get an idea of how your systems are doing. So monitoring a vSAN is a little bit different than monitoring your regular data stores, because the vSAN is so much more complex under the hood. It's storing more than one copy of your data, it's distributing it across the systems, and there's a lot of places you can have a bottleneck. The vSAN Observer lets you see that. It's a bit of a pain to get it running, but once you've got it, then it works really well.
You know, Don, you also mentioned storage policies, and when I think of things like policies, I think of, you know, in other systems like group policy, and it limits the ability of people to do certain configurations. Maybe you got file classification, you don't want somebody storing a file, but storage policies seem to be quite the opposite here in VMware, almost like an SLA for your VMs.
Yeah, they really are, and you know, I had a warning about my policy. Some of you guys might have saw it at the bottom of my screen where it was saying the storage I picked didn't match my policy. Well, you can create storage policies, and it's really important when you have tiered storage, right? Anytime you have tiered storage, you don't necessarily want everything being thrown on there. You're trying to prioritize traffic, and you can use your service policies to be able to handle that. You don't have to, it's an optional thing, but if you want to use your storage policies are really important when you're doing multipathing. I'm not doing multipathing here, I just have my vSAN set up, so I may not choose to use storage policies at all, but if you do, there's some neat options that you can set. Let me just run through those real quick. So if I go back to my cluster, inside of my cluster, if I want to start configuring my policies, or actually, you know what, you don't do it from the cluster, sorry. You can monitor it from the cluster, but if I want to get it configured, I need to go all the way back to my home. Way back to home, and right here you've got your virtual machine storage policies, right? That's where I want to go. And the policies are defined at the vCenter level. And oh shoot, you know that this little web UI bug is going to drive me nuts. So it'll reload. But basically we define it at the vCenter level because this policy might apply to more than one vSAN, might apply to more than one cluster. It can apply at a very high level if we want, or it can be very granular too. We've got a few options with how that gets deployed. But what we do is we come in here and we basically define how we want that storage to be used. I've got two default policies. There's the virtual SAN default storage policy and the virtual volume no requirements policy, right? So when I apply storage, if I've got the vVol no requirements policy on it, then anybody can use it. It's got no requirements. But with the virtual SAN default storage policy, here's where we can dictate how that virtual SAN is being handled. And I knew I should have reloaded the browser. VMware will patch this bug eventually. It's just kind of one of the things we have to suffer through right now. But basically what we can do is we go through and dictate how we want that virtual SAN to be used. And that's important. That'll resolve the error that I saw on the screen earlier. It really wasn't an error, it was a warning, and you could have ignored it and just moved on. But basically when we go in here and start to tweak with that default storage policy, you'll see the various settings in here that dictate how that's being handled, okay? And you have what are called rule sets, and the rules are indicating how much space to reserve, how much flash read cache is being reserved, number of failures to tolerate. That's pretty important. Right now, I just have 2 disks. So how many failures can I tolerate? 1. If I increase this policy to 2, I need to be able to survive 2 failures. I've only got 2 disks in my vSAN, so my vSAN no longer matches this policy. It won't let me put any more data on the vSAN until I correct this, right? It stops me. So this is the service level agreement that Wes was talking about. If I'm promising people 2 disk failure, I can enforce that right here. number of disk stripes per object, right? So if I'm breaking a file up like with RAID 0, how many stripes do I need to be able to maintain? And the default is 1. You can increase that, however. Force provisioning, right? Do I want to force these disks to come into the vSAN or not? It's all up to us how we want to define that, and you can create more than one rule set to meet several complex scenarios if you want.
And would this be something, Don, you would use on, like, maybe you got a mission critical application and you need performance on it, like maybe a database is being hosted on this? Is this where you would set a policy like that?
Oh yeah. You create more than one policy, right? So you'd have a vSAN policy for mission critical stuff and a vSAN policy for lab and dev stuff. And on the lab and dev stuff, you might not require redundancy at all. But on the mission critical stuff, you force 2 disk failure and so on. And now when I go to create VMs and I apply it to a data store, I only apply it to data stores that have the mission critical policy, right? You create those to meet your business needs. You don't have to create them. You can use your noodle every time you create a machine and throw it in there. But if you have the service policies in place, it makes sure that people don't make mistakes. Like, ooh, sorry, I deployed our email server onto this vSAN that was for test and dev. Sorry guys, now we lost all our data, right? Having a policy in place prevents that from happening. So great option there. And then the last thing that we talked about but didn't see were the fault domains. I didn't really mess with those. I actually never even set up our witness server. So if I jump back to my cluster, so I'm going to go back to lab cluster and I'm going to go to my virtual SAN. When you go to configure the virtual SAN, I need to go back to settings and virtual SAN. We can go right here to fault domains. And inside of the fault domains, we can define it. Now, technically, I didn't configure fault domains, but it did create them for me. If you don't configure fault domains, it puts each server in its own fault domain. So technically, host 01 and host 02 are in their own fault domains right now. But my configuration can tolerate a maximum of 0 host failures right now. It's not happy about it because each fault domain only has a single host. VMware recommends that you have 2 servers in every fault domain at a minimum, and then go from there. Since these guys are their own fault domains, it's 2 domains with only 1 server in each, so technically I can't tolerate a failure, all right? But we can come through here and we can add new fault domains and then we can move the hosts into them. So I might create a fault domain for just host 1 or host 1 and host 2, and we can put them into, maybe it's rack 1, and so I'm defining each of my racks, or maybe it's my production data center and my disaster recovery data center, however I want to name that, and so I can park them each in there by doing that. And so I'm moving host 1 into this new fault domain, and then I can add another one which I'll call rack 2, and this time host 01 doesn't show up because it's already in a fault domain. You can move it though if you change this to all hosts, and now I'll see everybody, but that one already shows as being in rack 1. All right, and so I'll hit OK, and so that one's going to moved over, and we might need to refresh before it takes effect, but there they go. So now they're in those 2 separate fault domains, right? So host 01, host 02, they're separated. And we know that when we deploy virtual machines, if I deploy a virtual machine and I've got 2 servers here in rack 1, I don't want both copies of that virtual machine's drive to be right here in rack 1. Because if rack 1 fails, I lose both of their drives. So one copy will be in rack 1 and the other copy will be in rack 2. It'll spread them out across the fault domains. We don't want our copies all in the same domain. It doesn't know to do that unless we set it up and define it like what I'm doing here. Okay, so that gets that set up so that we'll be able to handle that communication. All right, so we're looking pretty good there. Most of our configuration is in business. We've got our disks added in. We've got our fault domains configured. We've got a pretty healthy vSAN at this point. And now it's just business as usual. From here, we start creating our virtual machines. And when you pick a data store, you just pick the vSAN data store. Everything else runs like normal from here. We've got it created, we've got it in place, and it's a pretty neat solution. I now effectively have a SAN. I've got shared network across my systems, but I don't have a physical SAN. It's all done virtually right here inside of the software.
Not a lot of options and considerations when you're going to bring one of these virtual SANs online, but I will say, judging by that clock, does look like we're coming to the end of another episode. But before we do you have any additional words on virtual SANs?
Main thing, don't rush on those warnings. In fact, I don't know if you guys noticed, but the warnings that were on host 01 and host 2, those have disappeared now, the communication warnings. That on some of these, you just need to give a little time to settle down. The vSANs take a little while to register, especially if you don't have a ton of memory like mine right now. So don't get too much in a hurry on the initial setup. Now, once it's set up, like a month from now, if a warning pops up, yeah, immediately get on that. You need to deal with it. But the first time you set up a vSAN, plan for giving it 10 or 15 minutes just to settle down and sort itself out, and then start working with it and trying to resolve any warnings you've got.
Well, Don, we appreciate you joining us, and you, the viewer, as well. Thank you for joining us. Signing out for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Wes Bryan,
And I'm Don Pizzette.
and we'll see you next time.